Good evening, fourth graders, and welcome back to another flipped lesson. Tonight's lesson is going to be on long division. Now, for some of you, long division might be very overwhelming because division might be overwhelming for you. But if you follow certain steps, similar to the steps that we learned for multiplying by a two-digit number, you'll be fine. So I want you right now to remember that if at any time during this video you get confused, you can pause it. You can rewind the video and go back and review any of the information that might have been confusing to you. Or you can write down questions that you have at the end. So before we get started in talking about long division, let's go back and remind ourselves what division is. So division is breaking down a number into groups. Remember when we talked about multiplication and multiplication was building up? And we thought of repeated addition because the number kept getting larger and larger. Division is repeated subtraction, so we keep taking that same number away. It's the opposite of multiplication. That's why I wrote division undoes multiplication. Now, in your global section of your notebook, I want you to write an example of how you might take a number and break that down into groups. I have tons of examples that I can think of, and they all have to do with food. Take a minute right now and write that down in your global section. Okay. We're used to looking at division problems with a symbol that looks like this. That symbol says divided by. So when we're looking at this sentence, this division sentence, it says 30 divided by 5 equals 6. The first number in a division problem is going to be the largest number. Very similar to your subtraction problems. When you're subtracting, the larger number always goes on top. Well, when we're dividing, the largest number always comes first when we're looking at a division symbol that looks like this. We're used to that. Now as fourth graders, we're going to step it up a bit, and we're going to challenge ourselves to divide much larger numbers. We're also used to the fact that fast facts in multiplication help us with our division. So we know that 5 times 6 equals 30. That helps us when we're dividing 30 by 5. Same for 18 divided by 2 equals 9. Since we know our fast facts with multiplication and that 9 times 2 equals 18, then we also know that division fact, that 18 divided by 2 equals 9. Now, let's go towards what we're going to see in fourth grade. In fourth grade, you're going to see symbols that look like this. I like to look at those symbols as there's a number inside the house, there's a number outside of the house, and there's a number up on top of the roof. Now, take a couple of minutes now and jot down these notes in your vocabulary section of your notebook. Okay, so remember I said that there was a number inside the house. Well, the number inside the house has a name, and the name is a dividend. The dividend is the number that we want to divide up. We want to break that number down. The number outside of the house is the divisor, and that is the number that we're dividing by. So the dividend, the number inside the house, is always going to be larger than the number outside of the house because it's easier, or only possible, to take a large number and break it down. It's really hard to take a small number and break it down into bigger groups, right? That doesn't really make sense. So the number inside the house is always going to be larger than the number outside of the house. And then the number on top of the house or on the roof is the answer to a division problem. And that's called a quotient. So the quotient always goes up on top of the roof. Remember I said that I had tons of real-world examples of division problems? And I said that I always think about food. I think about dividing up a hamburger if I'm sharing a hamburger with someone. I think of dividing up a pizza if I'm sharing a pizza with someone. I think of dividing up a bag of candy if I got a bag of candy for Halloween. I'm always thinking about food, which makes our process with long division ironic that it has to do with food. Our process follows this acronym, and I always think of this before I do a long division problem. And the acronym is, does McDonald's sell cheeseburgers? That sentence always reminds me of division because I'm always thinking of dividing up a cheeseburger when I'm sharing it with a friend. Each letter stands for something, stands for an operation in math that we're going to do in long division. So the D in does stands for division. So first we divide. The M in McDonald's stands for multiply. The S stands for subtraction. The C stands for check. And the B stands for bring down. I want you to write this sentence in your vocabulary section as well, because writing this down or on top of each page that you complete with long division problems will help you to remember the certain steps in order to get the correct answer. So go ahead and write that down now. If you want, you can put the symbols, the operation that you're doing, down below that first letter, just to remind you what that letter stands for. Let's take a look at the first example. Now, remember I said that as fourth graders, we're going to look at much larger problems. So if we're looking at the number inside the house now, this number is a lot larger than we're used to. So the dividend is 366. And we have to see how many times the divisor goes into 366. So we ask ourselves, how many times does 6 go into 366? How many times does my divisor go into my dividend? The first thing I want you to do when you're looking at a very large dividend is to remember that long division is broken up into steps, and you have to break up your dividend into certain steps. So the first step that I want you to look at is the first number that we see in our dividend, and that's a 3. So we ask ourselves, how many times can we put 6 into 3? Well, we can't put 6 into 3. Remember we said that the dividend has to be a larger number. So 6 can't go into 3. So we're going to put a 0 because it doesn't go in there at all. So the next number that I look at is 36. How many times does 6 go into 36? And if I know my fast facts, I know that 6 goes into 36 6 times. Or I could say 36 divided by 6 equals 6. And I'm going to put my answer on top of the roof, remember, because that's where my answers go. So I've done my first step. I've divided 36 into 6 groups. So I've done the first step, now I have to go to my M, my multiplication. And I'm multiplying the number that I put on the roof by my divisor. So I'm going to just make a little multiplication sign on the corner of my house to remind myself that that's what I do next. So I have 6 times 6. Well, I know that 6 times 6 is 36. So I write that answer down below, making sure that I'm putting it in the correct place value. After I do that, I look at my next step. So I've divided, then I multiplied, and I brought my answer down. Now I subtract, and I'm going to subtract 36 from 36. And I know that the answer is 0. So I'm going to write my zeros down below, because I always show my work in long division. It's very important. So I can always go back and see where I went wrong or what I need to fix. Now, I've done my division, I did my multiplication, I did my subtraction. Now, I have to check. Well, before I check, I have to create a new division problem. And I do that just by making my equal sign into that division symbol that we're going to be seeing a lot more now as 4th graders. So I check to see if I can divide 0 by 6. And I can't. Remember, I said that the dividend has to be larger than the divisor. So since it's not, since I checked it to see if I could, and it's not, I jump to my last step, and my last step is to bring down. So I'm going to bring down this number 6 that we haven't touched yet. And I'm going to bring that down into a new division problem. So now I'm looking at 6 divided by 6, and I ask myself, how many times does 6 go into 6? And that answer is once. I can put 6 into 6 one time, and I'm going to put the answer on top of the roof right above that place value, because that was the place value that I just divided. So 6 goes into 6 one time. And now I start all over again. So I just created a new division problem, and I just divided, and I got my answer of 1. So now I multiply. And now I'm multiplying the number that I just put on the roof. And I'm still multiplying that times my divisor. So I multiply 1 times 6, and that gives me 6. And I'm going to write that again right below the 6 that I just divided. My next step is to subtract, so I put my subtraction symbol, and I subtract 6 from 6, and that gives me 0. I don't have any more numbers to bring down, and I know that I can't put 6 into 0, so my problem is done now. So the answer, the quotient to 366 divided by 6 is 61. Let's take a look at example number 2. Again, the number inside the house, the dividend, is much larger than we're used to. So we have to follow the steps of long division. The first thing that I do is I look at the first place value, or the first number in my dividend, and that's a 5. So I ask myself, how many times can 5 go into 5? And the answer is once. I can put 5 into 5 one time. So I'm going to put my answer up on top of the roof above that 5, because that's going to remind me that 5 went into 5 once. Did my first step. Now I look at the M for multiply, and I'm going to put that multiplication symbol on the corner of my house. So now I multiply 1 by 5, 1 times 5, and that equals 5, and I put that down below in that place value, because that was the place value that I just divided. After I bring it down, I subtract. After I multiply, I subtract. And I subtract 5 minus 5, and that gives me 0. Before I check, I create my new division problem. And my new division problem looks like this. So I ask myself, I check, can 5 go into 0? It can't. Remember, that number inside the house has to be larger than the number outside of the house. And if it's not, we have to find another solution. So I jump to the next step, and that's to bring down. So the next number that I'm going to bring down is the 6, because that's the next place value that I see in my dividend. I'm going to bring down that 6 into my new division problem. So now I have 6 divided by 5. Well, can 5 go into 6? So you ask yourself that question. 5 can go into 6, but it doesn't go in evenly. So if it doesn't go in evenly, if your divisor doesn't go inside your dividend evenly, you have to see how many times it'll go in without going over. So I know that 5 can go into 6 one time without being greater than 6. If I were to put a 2 up here, then 2 times 5 would give me 10. And 10 is a greater number than what is inside the house already. So 5 goes into 6 one time. And again, I write that above that place value, the place value that I just did my new division problem with. And then I start over. That was my new division problem. I wrote my answer up top on top of the house. Now I multiply. 1 times 5. 1 times 5 is equal to 5. After I do my multiplication, I subtract. 6 minus 5 equals 1. Now, before I check, I create a new division problem. And I ask myself, how many times does 5 go into 1? Well, number 1 on the inside of the house is smaller than the number outside, so I can't do it. I have to go to my next step, my last step, which is bring down. So I go to the 5, and that 5 we haven't touched yet, so I bring that 5 all the way down to my new division problem. So my new division problem now says 15 divided by 5. So I ask myself, how many times does 5 go into 15? And I know, because my fast facts, that 5 goes into 15 3 times. So I write that answer on top of the house, on top of the roof, because 5 goes into 15 3 times. The next part is multiply. So I multiply 3 times 5, and 3 times 5 is equal to 15. Then I subtract 15 minus 15, and that is 0. I look to see if there are any more numbers to bring down, because 5 cannot go into 0. There aren't any more numbers to bring down, so I know my division problem is over. So that tells me that the quotient to this division problem, 565 divided by 5, is 113. I think you guys are ready to try a few problems on your own. With these two problems, I want you to remember that acronym, does McDonald's sell cheeseburgers? Remember to follow each of those steps. Remember how I am with steps. If you follow those steps, it'll make for a very happy student and a very happy teacher. I hope you have fun, and I hope that if you have any questions, you'll write them down in the questions section of your notebook. And if you have any suggestions or another acronym that will help, please write that down so you can share it with your friends tomorrow. Have a good night. Bye.